All right, so this is the translation tips from DGN to DWG, and I just went over an overview of some differences between the two platforms, AutoCAD and MicroStation. And I just talked about standards, and that's something that you're going to have to care for, which I'll show you a little bit about here in the webinar. Also, if you're designing in MicroStation and you're saving to AutoCAD and know you're going to be doing that, and many companies that we deal with have to do that just to keep the doors open. For example, we've got many customers that are all MicroStation oriented or mostly MicroStation oriented, and they sometimes get jobs that they have to deliver in AutoCAD format to keep the doors open. And we also have other clients that are more AutoCAD oriented, and they bid on AutoCAD or MicroStation jobs where the final format they have to deliver is in MicroStation format. And they do that again just to keep the doors open, keep business flowing through the place. So in those cases, they either one, they have to care for then doing the work in the platform that they're familiar with, and then exporting the files out to the format that are required for delivery for the job. So this is much more of an issue than it used to be, as more and more companies are dealing with one format or the other based on where their forte and power is as far as what they're familiar with. Now, we're going to take a look at how to use MicroStation to control and manage the translation process. And the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at an AutoCAD drawing, and we're going to open it in MicroStation, and we're going to translate it then to DGN. Now, probably the most fundamental problem you'll bump into is this. Now, I'm going to open up a blank file here first. I've got that's called blank. And now I'm going to go to the File menu and go Open, and I'm going to select a DWG file. And notice at the bottom here of this dialog box, there's an option button. If I click on the DGN file, notice the option button is grayed out. When I click on DWG, it is accessible. So this is where I can use things or set things to make sure that when I open a DWG file, to make sure, or then with the intention of translating it out as DGN, it's going to come out the way I expect it. So I'll click Options, and one of the first things that you run into is that in MicroStation, that people that are doing civil work for the most part, you've got a U.S. survey foot that is a standard unit in MicroStation, which is used by departments of transportation and related organizations and their contractors as a result. But AutoCAD doesn't really have a difference between a U.S. survey foot and a standard imperial foot. You're just using master units, so it's either foot, survey foot, or whatever you designate the file to be. But when you're opening a DWG file that's done in feet, and you want it to become U.S. survey feet for use in MicroStation, then if you don't set up the units in this options area correctly, you're going to get a small discrepancy. And I hear this all the time. I open the DWG files for my civil project, and things aren't in the right location. I've got to scale them. I've got to do all this sorts of thing to get them to look right. So if you're bumping into that, it's because you don't have your options set correctly here. You see the options button that I got into. Now I'm in the DWG Open Options. And once you select the file, it then allows you to get here. So if you're attaching DWGs as references and you can't seem to make them work out right, the problem is that this area is something that you need to address, because it's not that everything's all broke, it's just you don't have the settings properly. So now we're going to take a look. We've got this basic category here that you see. If I click on the little minus sign, you see it collapses and then it expands here. And one of the settings that you see here is for architectural or engineering units. And if you have files that use these, almost always you're going to have this set or see this set as inches here, and as you see right here. Most civil shops are not using those. They're using the next one, which is decimal, scientific, or fractional units. And the default for this is going to be, I don't have it set to the default, but the default is design center units. So what happens is if you don't change this and you open a DWG file, you've probably always all seen the dialog box, if you've done anything like this, that says MicroStation can't determine what the units of this file are. Pick the units that you want. And if you've got a civil file coming in and you say, oh, I need to use U.S. survey feet, what happens is if you just select that, if you just say U.S. survey feet here, what happens is these unspecified design center units are going to use feet or whatever you choose from the list. So, and that's where if you need it to be U.S. survey foot for working in a microstation civil engineering project, it's going to cause a discrepancy because of that. So you don't want to choose just U.S. survey feet, because the feet in AutoCAD and the U.S. survey foot in MicroStation, when you have that option set, it's going to be, things are going to be off a little bit, and that even applies to references. So this is where if you set the setting correctly, it's going to handle things not only for the files you open directly, but any references that are attached as well. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to set this to seed file master units. Now, what does this mean? Well, when you're the easiest way to control this sort of thing, to make sure that you've got the units that you need when you open the DWG file, is use a seed file that in most cases is going to be given to you by the client that you're doing the work for, like State Department of Transportation or something like that. And they're more than likely going to have the units set within that in the design file settings. And I'm going to cancel this dialog box for a minute, and I'm going to open up a trans seed file for translation that I set up specifically for this webinar. And I just named it Transseed 1 because I took it from, and I'll show you this here. Notice I've got this seed shortcut. When I go to that, notice the folder I'm looking in. It's C Program Data Bentley MicroStation VDI Select Series, which is I'm using Select Series 4 here. I got a question here on if this method that I'm going to use would apply for AutoCAD 2018. It will in the newer version of MicroStation, MicroStation Connect. In other words, the options that I'm showing you, I think it's MicroStation Connect update version 10 or 11 now uses or can now allow you to import AutoCAD 2017, 2018, 2019 format files to answer the question that I saw here in the chat. So, and it has the same type of options that I'm showing you here with MicroStation V8i. So just about everything I show you will apply also to the newer AutoCAD formats, yes, to answer that question. Now I'll continue here. So this folder that I'm in has the seed files that are the default seed files for you to use with MicroStation. And what I did is I took this trans seed file and I made a copy of it, just named it Transseed 1 as you see here. And then I set the settings for it to be able to, and made them set to US survey foot or US survey feet. And the reason I did that is that file by default is mechanically oriented. So it's going to have measurements in metric. So what I did is I just used that as a base to then create a sample translation seed file that I could use for the process I'm using here. And all I did was I moved it to another folder to make it quicker for me to access. In fact, let me go back here, and I'll just click back, and now I'm in the folder with my other files. So now I've got my translation seed file open here, and I'm just going to go to Settings, Design File, and you notice under Working Unit, see how I've got the mass unit set to US survey foot. The subunit is US survey inches, and then my accuracy I've got out to 4 decimal points. You can make it 4 decimal places. You can make it more if you need to. And now with that done, now that I've got that set, when I go back to File, Open, and select my DWG file, go back to Options, you notice that this setting for decimal, scientific, or fractional units, I set to seed file design, seed file master units, and then under the seed file, I selected that transseed1.dgn file, which has the mass units set to US survey feet. This is going to then control the opening of the DWG file to where no matter what the unit set for is set for in AutoCAD, let's say it's set to foot, when you do the translation as far as opening it in MicroStation and then saving it out as a MicroStation file, it's going to translate out as US survey feet. And this is where that problem that I mentioned earlier, where things in references aren't quite matching the right spot they should, or other things in the design files you open that were DWG files that you just saved as DGN files, where things aren't quite in the right place, this will handle that. And again, it's simply because in AutoCAD, when it comes to civil-oriented stuff, it's just feet is what's used, an imperial foot. But in MicroStation, it's almost always a U.S. survey foot. And so the slight differences between them, I think it's one U.S. survey foot is 1.00001 imperial feet. So it's not a big difference, but as you get out to thousands of yards and miles and stuff, that difference becomes very apparent, particularly when you're doing roadway projects and civil-oriented projects. So that's one thing that you need to care for related to doing translations. Now, this is very fundamental and very important, and a lot of standards, another thing that you might need to care for, many standards, the thing I'm going to discuss now that was important in more years ago than maybe 10, 20 years ago, was using a global origin. Now, Caltrans, California Department of Transportation, still uses it, and that in the civil world, it's a global origin that was used for their particular files. And if you have a standard that requires the use of a global origin, and you would get that data from the client that you're doing the work for, if they require that as part of the standards of the files now they're set up, it's important for the seed file that you're using to have that data in it, and then you pick the seed file that has the right working units, as I mentioned earlier, but also has the global origin that you're required to have. Now, a lot of standards, especially V8, no longer emphasize a particular global origin, but if they do, again, you can make that work by picking the correct seed file, which you're almost always going to get supplied to you by the entity you're doing the work for. And it'll have the global origin and the working units that you want to use. And that's pretty critical. And if you don't do this, you're going to be pulling your hair out because things aren't going to be in the right locations. But if you use the DWG options here and you got the right seed file, then you'll be able to set them correctly. Now, the way you do that for the global origin here is under Advanced, it's got the setting, and notice it says Use Seed File Global Origin. It's off by default. So if you have a requirement and a specification from your client that says you need to use the seed file global origin from the seed file that they supplied, and you don't specifically go in and turn this on, and you just start creating your files and doing your work, then the measurements and where things are located is going to all be off related to that global origin. So this is something that if that's there, you very specifically want to go into these settings and make sure that you turn this on. And then once you do, then the files that you create related to the seed file that was supplied to you by the client you're doing the work for, the files will be created and things will end up being in the right place, that sort of thing. The next options also in this location that are important are, when I go back up here to the basic area, is model space and paper space. Now, if the default, I'm going to turn these off here, is for model space to come in as 3D from an AutoCAD file when you're opening it, and paper space to come in as 2D, which is standard in how AutoCAD's set up. But when you're importing those files, if you need them to be flat or 2D in both model space and paper space as far as the geometry and then the sheet files, then you specifically have to go in and turn these options on to make sure that they're 2D no matter what. So this is just something that you may need to care for when opening the files, and if you specifically are going to be doing work in 2D, then you just make sure to turn these on. And then that way when you translate the files out to MicroStation, they'll be in the format that you need. Now the files I'm going to translate are going to be flat, and they're just a little architectural type files for a demonstration. So I want model space and paper space to be 2D when I open them, so I'll just leave them set as I just set them here. And so when MicroStation creates or translates the files to DGN, it'll separate them out a little bit as well. Now, these are all the basic category, and then I showed you what was in the advanced area for the global origin. And another thing that you can handle right also in this area, settings area, is line weights. Now in MicroStation, you have arbitrary numbers assigned to line weights. In AutoCAD format, though, you have specific measurements that are set for each line weight, as you see represented here. So what you can do is you can either, if you want all the line work to appear the same, then what you would do is map each one of these. You can just click on the number here and set it to whatever measurement you want it as far as what's associated with 0 line weight and the different numbers here. So you can remap these as you need. Again, since I'm going DWG to microstation, it doesn't allow me to rechange the microstation items. It only allows me to set the DWG weights. So if I wanted everything to go to, no matter what the line thickness was, if I wanted it to go to 0, for example, DGN 0 line weight, then what I would do is I would set all these to 0, and they would all come out as the DGN weight 0. But if I have others, like sometimes there's only going to be a certain set of DWG line weight to utilize, and once you get up to a certain point, as you'll see here as I scroll down, it then just leaves the measurement, which I think is the max in AutoCAD, as 2.11. So you can adjust these as needed so that the line weights map to whatever the DGN line weights are that you want when you open the files. All right, so that's all we've got in that area. And now I'm going to select my A-201 DWG, and I'm going to open it in MicroStation. And again, this is going to be architectural or engineering units. And so there's the file when I open it. And notice when I go to settings now, design file, see it is set to architectural and it says feet. So that's because in that file itself, that's what it is. But the translation seed file I used is going to map that or push things from that feet unit to the MicroStation US survey foot through my seed file. Then you see it's going to be feet and inches when it's all said and done here. So let me see. So now if I scroll out a little bit and I go to my measurements here, I'm just going to measure my, let's see, I got this right here. Yeah, I'm going to, won't allow me to do this here. Line string, there's my measurement tools, wrong one. So I'm going to measure this to see what units I've got. And you see this is I think a standard C border. So it's 2 feet, 10 inches, or 36, or 30, I forgot the hell to measure, 32 inches by 32 inches here. Or 32 by 24, I think it is. Okay, so this is a C-type drawing. So I didn't get any fractional things related to or odd measurements when I measured that top portion. So that tells me that at least as far as opening it in MicroStation, the way I did, the units are coming out as something that I would expect. And so here you see it's 22, so it's 34 by 22, which I think is C. Now we'll go from here, we'll look at the levels, because this is something that later we're going to have to map. So when I go to levels, notice I've got 0, which in AutoCAD is the rough equivalent to the default level in MicroStation. And then you'll almost always see in an AutoCAD file this dev points, which is things related to dimensions that you don't really want to plot, that sort of thing. So you'll almost always see a level like that. And the reason I'm showing you this is when I go back now to File, Save As, and notice my options here, I'm going to tell it to save as a DGN file. When I go to Options, see I've got this first category, which is Remap. And I actually set up a sample comma-separated value file that you see here. When I go to Edit, so this is the sample seed file, or the comma-separated value file. And this is where you map things like layers to levels, colors to colors, line weights, although you can do this through the initial settings box I show you when you first open the DWG file. Line styles you can map, and fonts you can map as well. Now, you use this to control the mappings of fonts to fonts and levels to layers and things like that. And this is where the finer control comes in for the translation. Now, after you've got this set up, if I go File and save it, for some reason it's not allowing me to apply the mappings that I set up. Maybe I'm telling it to, because I picked the wrong option, that's why. Let me go back here. See, so any of the mappings that I set up in that comma separated value file, it actually opens that file in Excel format, but then when you save the settings after you've got the mappings done that you want to do, in fact, let me go back into it again, show you one other thing. So at the top of like levels, for example, you see this little button here. When you click that, whatever design or DWG file you've got open in this case, it'll look in that file for the levels that are in that. So if you want to make mappings for a bunch of different files that you're going to be importing or opening in MicroStation, then exporting out as MicroStation files, then you'll either want to create a DWG template file or something like that that has all the possible layers and all possible fonts and colors and things like that, and then use that file first to open that in MicroStation, and then come and click this button, then it would populate this input side with all the levels or layers used in that file. That'll save you some time if you can push all of that information into like a single DWG file, like a template file, a DWT file. That way, when you press the button, then if all the levels that are used within any of the files that you're going to be translating from AutoCAD to MicroStation are in that DWT file, then it'll save you some time. You don't have to go out and manually collect them all. You just push this button, and it'll take all the levels in that DWT file and populate at least the input side. Then on the output side, you're going to have to go through the level table in MicroStation and grab a file that's representative of the files that you need on the output side. And you can export a level table out to I think a spreadsheet or a comma separated value file. And then you can grab the data from there, copy and paste it into the V8 output level side. And then you can move these around to map level to layer specifically. You know, same sort of thing for colors, the same sort of thing for line styles and fonts. When you've got this all set up and you close it and it saves the file, it saves it out as a CWD form or a CSV form, and then you turn on the mappings that you set up that you want to be able to use for the translation and just click OK. Now, once that's done, you then give the file the name that you want and you click Save. And I've already got it replaced. In fact, I've already saved it out earlier. I'm just going to give this a different name because the numbers and data I used in the comma separated value file were just arbitrary, just for demonstration purposes. So the output of this file might not be exact as far as what I might want in a real world scenario. But it's now translated out to DGN form, and you see the colors just based on an earlier look. If I go back to the DWG file, it looks pretty much the same. There might be some differences, again, due to the arbitrary nature of what I used in the comma separated value file, but still pretty close. Now that I've got it out as a DGN file, if I go back to my settings and go to design file, notice that I've got feet and inches here, and it utilized the transseed seed file that I'd utilized in order to make this the proper measurements. In fact, let me go back out to my previously saved one, because just to make sure my measurements are all right here. Settings, design file. Yep, it's got feet, and now I'm just going to do a measurement to just check my work here. So if I go back along the top of my border, this should be 2 feet 10 inches, which it is. And then this should be 1 foot 10 inches here, which it is. So the transseed file was used, and the measurements aren't giving any odd leftover numbers after the inches. So the measurements are coming in the way I expected them to. So that's the input side as far as, and output side as far as going from DWG to then DGN file. And now I'm going to go the opposite way here, and I'm going to go out and save this file as a DWG file. So let me see here. I kind of lost track of my bullet points of things I wanted to make sure I covered. Pardon me. All right. So I'm going to go File, Save As. I'm going to change my settings here to DWG. Notice I've got my options here as well. And this just handles the opposite side of, instead of going on the input side, this is now the output options for going from MicroStation to AutoCAD. So this dialog box looks very similar to the one I showed you earlier, going from AutoCAD to MicroStation. Now, DWG version, and this is related to a question that I got earlier. Does the things that I show you here work with AutoCAD 2018? Now, this particular version of MicroStation, which is MicroStation V8i Select Series 4, and this is something that you may need to care for on your end, because the different versions of MicroStation and different versions of AutoCAD, when it comes to what versions of the other file format they can use, or even their own file format, varies as they come out with new versions. So as you come out with a new version of MicroStation, some of the older version-related things might not be available or be able to be opened or utilized anymore. Similar with AutoCAD, some of the older file formats are left by the wayside. Now, this particular version of MicroStation, when I click DWG version, you'll see that it goes up to 2016. That's because MicroStation Connect, as of update 10 or 11, is now the only version that you can import and export out to 2017 and above AutoCAD-wise. But this version also goes back only to R14. So as long as the files that you needed to open or export out as, in this case, within these ranges of AutoCAD files, then you could use this version of MicroStation. If you need to go to an older version, you'll have to find an older version of MicroStation that supports something older than R14. If you need to go to a newer version of AutoCAD, then you'll need to go to MicroStation Connect Update 10 or 11. Also, you'll see here, you've got drop unsupported line styles. This would be for things like you've got line styles in MicroStation, and when you do some test translations, they don't come out they don't come out at all. And what you can do with the line styles going from MicroStation to AutoCAD is this. You have to decide if you want the line work to be line work when it comes out into the AutoCAD side. In other words, do you want to be able to manipulate the data as a line? In other words, be able to work on the files like you would normally in DWG format. If it's just a matter of you want to just be able to view the data and plot the data, then you would turn this option on to drop the unsupported line styles. What this will do is the different pieces of a line, like let's say it's long dash, space, short dash, space, long dash, is it will drop those individual pieces into individual elements. So when you translate out to the AutoCAD format, in this case, you'll see the data as that line style as it displayed in MicroStation, but you won't be able to grab that line as a line that you could then do something with in the AutoCAD side. Again, you would only want to do that if on the output side of the AutoCAD format, all you wanted to do was view it and then do plots from it. But if you need it to be line work that you can do something with, then you would not want to use that particular option. You'll also see under references, now MicroStation and AutoCAD deal with references a little bit differently, in some cases the same, but you'll see here it says create overlays for references, no live nesting. In AutoCAD, you don't really have like live nesting like you do in MicroStation. So in this case, what would happen is it would just take, if you had a design file that had a reference attached to another reference, attached to another reference, attached to another reference, nested down, I think, up to 9 levels in the MicroStation side, then with that option on, what would happen is it would look down all of those connections to connections, down to reference, 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 and it would break that when you're doing the output to DWG and bring the reference, no matter how far it was down in that nesting level, up to where it's directly connected to the DWG file. In other words, it's not connected to another file, connected to another file. It's just right there off the DWG file. Again, on line weights, now I showed you on the input side for DWG to MicroStation, you can map the line weights. And you can do it on the output side too. So in this case, you can take the MicroStation DWG weight and map it to the specific weight that you want in your output DWG file. Under references here, now you can, for the external references, you can retain them, you can merge them into the file, or you can merge them to a cell or a block, actually in this case, or you could omit them. For self-references, this is where the file has a reference to its own self, in other words, model to a model, that sort of thing. You can also either merge them into the one file or one area in the, it would be in model space in AutoCAD, or you can omit them, or you can merge it into a cell or block. Same thing with non-default models. So the default model is when you first create a design file in MicroStation, it has a default model. That's basically just a space where you can put design elements. But then you can also have other models created in the MicroStation file. It's basically, the idea is that when you compare to AutoCAD, you have model space, but in MicroStation you could have multiple model spaces. But you can also have, like you have in AutoCAD, where you have paper space and a number of different layouts there, you can have the same sort of thing in MicroStation. So the difference in MicroStation is that you don't have one model space, or you could have, but in other cases you could have multiple model spaces. So this gives you a way to handle the non-default models, which would be, instead of the first one created, it's the other, quote, model spaces and how to handle those. And you can either merge them into the one model space in AutoCAD, or merge it into a block, or omit it entirely. If you have attachments that are masked, you can retain them. You can merge to a block or omit them. And allow optimized clip for reference merge. You would choose this as a merge option here, or you have the ability so that filled shapes or region and stuff like that to make sure that they're still filled if you've optimized the clip. If you don't optimize the clip, then what will happen is you'll end up with filled shapes or regions that actually don't come in filled. So with this, it'll optimize the clip if there is one, and then it'll still make sure that they're filled when you get to the DWG side. Unnest or copy live nested references. This is what I was talking about earlier. When we turn this on, again, it just, in AutoCAD, you have two types of attachments. Overlays, which are no live nesting. You can only see what's in the attached file directly. And if that file has references, you don't see any of the geometry from the reference of the file that you're attaching. If you want, you can click this, and any XREF that has references to references or references, rather than creating a live nesting for that attachment, it's going to just unnest it, and it's going to create a direct attachment for each nested reference that may be attached. And that's something that you can handle right there. Now, I'm not going to go into everything here. When you go to filter, if you're doing one file at a time, you have these options, and you may, for example, depending on your file, you may only want the model geometry. You may not want a layout. You may not want the layouts, or in MicroStation, the sheet files. So you can do some filtering by clicking filtering here, and then saying, I only want things within a fence or a selection set. And if you say fence, if there was a fence here, it would then allow me to select that, and then you could say inside or crossing, that sort of thing. If I click models, then you can choose the models in the current design file. You could click one or use your shift key and click the others that you want to be able to translate. The blocks, tags, named groups. Unused shared cell definitions. So, for example, if you turn this off, a block in AutoCAD, it essentially is a shared cell in MicroStation. it behaves the same or similarly. And if you turn this off, it's going to convert blocks to normal or regular cells. Or it's actually just going to leave them alone. So if they're unused, it's going to go ahead and copy the shared cell definitions into AutoCAD as an AutoCAD block, but without any block references in the file. But it'll be available for you to create block references once you've got it translated out to DWG form. See, for tags, if you turn off tags here, it's not going to bring in block attributes from AutoCAD. It's going to drop them. And see, that's pretty much it. All right, so I lost my location here, my bullet points here. Give me a second. I've already gone over that. I've already gone mappings. Wow, I covered everything faster. No wonder I was in the wrong spot. All right. So so that's the basics of the things I wanted to cover, to going from AutoCAD to MicroStation and then back out the other way as well. Oh, actually, one thing I did actually skip here. I kind of skipped around a bit. I apologize here. All right, so I'm going to go back and save my DWG file out again or my DGN file as DWG. And one thing you notice here is DWG seed file. Now, this seed file is something I took from MicroStation's own seed files. And again, depending on the units that you want to have, this is a similar thing that you want to care for in going the opposite way. In other words, instead of DWG to MicroStation going out, is just make sure you use a seed file that has, or a seed file for the DWG side that has the appropriate levels or layers and fonts and things like that you want the output file to have once you save out to a DWG form. And again, in most cases, if you're doing work in this fashion, where you're doing the work in MicroStation and you're saving it out as DWG in order to deliver the files to a client, in almost every instance, that client will be able to apply you with a template file or a DWG file that can act as a seed file in this particular case, and have the necessary layers and fonts and things like that you'll need to use. So that's the basic of your choices, going input to MicroStation and output from there to DWG. Now, with that being the case, that covers what I wanted to cover on the MicroStation side of handling and viewing a couple things of MicroStation that you could use to care for translations and handling translations. And then I just want to spend a brief amount of time on our own program that we utilize for translations here. And this is something that we used to do a lot of consulting for people doing translations from MicroStation AutoCAD and vice versa, because many of our clients have to do that sort of thing. And one of our product managers, he used to handle that consulting, and he actually covered a number of the topics that I covered with you here today as part of his consulting with people. And people would pay us a lot of money to have him help them do their translations. And during that process, he developed a bunch of pre-processing tools and also post-processing tools to help with the translation process. And he utilized initially the MicroStation command line driven translator, which many of the screens I showed you today are, in fact, the screens I showed you today in MicroStation are utilized in conjunction with that translator to help you translate files. What he did is he said, look, I could save our clients quite a bit of time and some money also by taking everything I've been doing on the consulting side of translations and tying it all up into one interface. In other words, all the pre-processing tools, and you see here there's this pre-processing button, all the post-processing tools that he developed as well, and you see here under the post-processing button, I can tie into the interface and then also set up the configuration of the translation so that it's laid out in a form that will help teach someone that doesn't know a lot about translations some of the different things that they'll have to care for related to doing translations. So what he did is he developed this program, Translation Manager. And you'll notice here when I went to configure and I clicked interface, this is a wizard interface. What he did was this, is he set up the different categories that you see here for controlling the translation so that each different setting is on its own settings page and has a description, as you see below, that gives the user things that they'll need to care for, that they may need to care for related to that particular setting when they're doing translations. His whole purpose of setting it up this way was to help train someone that doesn't know a lot about translations so that eventually they become a, quote, expert, end quote, and then they can go to expert mode. And all this does is that shifts the panel to where all of the settings for one particular category are on one particular panel. Now, a couple of things I'll point out related to this is all of the MicroStation V8 translators from V8, I think 8.5 up to Connect, we can utilize with this program, and it just looks on your system, looks for those translators that are available and makes them available in this drop-down list. And also AutoCAD 2010 and above translators we added a little bit later to be able to utilize as well. Now, just as a general rule, if you're going to be translating files, one thing I'll point out is this. The MicroStation translators always give you more control over the translation process than the AutoCAD translators. And here's how I know this. Notice I've got my Select V8i, MicroStation V8i Select Series 4 translator chosen. If I go to Configure, notice from Basic to Remap Symbology, there's 5 categories of setting that I can use to control the translation process. And that's going from AutoCAD to MicroStation. If I change that viewpoint and go MicroStation to AutoCAD and go to Configure, it gives me 9 categories from Basic down to Remap. So in both cases, they give you in either 5 categories of control or 9. However, if I go to the AutoCAD translator, MicroStation to AutoCAD, it gives you 3 categories. And the same thing if I go AutoCAD to MicroStation. Again, only 3 categories. The only reason I point this out is we run into, and I myself run into more often than I thought I would anyway. In fact, I ran into it 3 times this past 6 weeks, is I've found people who have a bunch of MicroStation files that are legacy back from like 20 years ago or more up to present time, and they only recently moved to AutoCAD. And they don't have any MicroStation left over in-house, but they need to periodically translate their files to MicroStation format. And 2 of those 3, when I talked to them and got more details on what they needed to care for on the output side of to get the files from MicroStation to AutoCAD form, is they actually needed settings from the MicroStation translator, either going from MicroStation to AutoCAD, where you have the 9 different categories, to handle things like cells where if they were regular cells placed all over the drawings, what they would do when translated to AutoCAD using the AutoCAD translator is each individual cell would come in as an individual name. In other words, if it was a bolt cell, the first instance would be bolt 1, the next instance of that same regular cell would be bolt 2, and so forth. That made it very, very difficult for them to be able to clean up and make the files into some easily usable form on the AutoCAD side of things. And there's one setting that the MicroStation translator, it gives you the ability to take those instances of that same cell and form them into a shared cell so that on the translation side, it just becomes a block definition that then has block references to the places where that cell was placed. So it's little things like that if you're going to be doing translations from MicroStation to AutoCAD in particular, where certain settings are going to get you better control of the output so that you don't have to do a bunch of cleanup on the output side, in this case in DWG form, then you may want to look at getting a subscription to a current version of MicroStation to help you with just the translation. And I haven't done research on this in about 8 or 10 years, but MicroStation does sell, or Bentley's sell MicroStation outright for a certain amount of money, but then they have a subscription which is somewhat less than the full product per year, and which, depending on if that's something that you need to do, you'll have to check that with them, and that may save you some heartache as far as the output side and controlling the translation so that the output files require as little or not any cleanup after you've got them translated. But that could also be the case if you're doing jobs where you have to go from AutoCAD to MicroStation and you want to have more control over that process. Then the MicroStation translator, if you don't happen to have MicroStation, could help you if you did have the MicroStation translator. So that's an overview of Translation Manager. I'll go into the pre-processing and post-processing steps here a little bit, just to show you where it can save you some time in translation. One is the evaluation step. Now, when I went over the comma separated value files using the MicroStation translator data itself, then when you pressed a button, it would take a look at the current active file and then import the layers for the DWG input file into one column in that comma separated value file. This can help you kind of bypass that. Notice it's got 3 files selected here. So you can select all of your input files through this area. And then when you click process, what it does is it scans all of them and it creates DAT files, which are text files with a .dat extension for each of the categories that you see here. So if I go back to disk here, and I'll show you from a previous run that I did, it creates these DAT files which you can use to populate the comma separated value file. This can save you a ton of time. When I go down to Translation Manager, you'll see I've got, this is the short name for the settings file for the program, AutoCAD to MicroStation, and then here's the levels DAT file. When I open it, you'll see this has got the levels from all of my input files. And I could use that also to do kind of the opposite translation, where I made it look like I was doing the opposite one, so I could use that pre-processing to also gather the levels for my output files. I just created the same sort of DAT file there. So now, once you do that, you can also do drops or explodes on the input files. You can modify them. You can do compresses and purges. And by default, it creates backups for the input files. And then also, on the post-processing side for cleanup, in fact, let me go back and set my AutoCAD to MicroStation. I'm almost done here, folks, by the way. Thanks for hanging around. So on the post-processing side, I can, oops, actually this is still not quite, oh, let me go back, open, AutoCAD to MicroStation, there we go, post-process, there we go. All right, so I can do some cleanups on the output translated files. I can remove text with only spaces, empty text. I can also remove unshared cell or block definitions. I can do drops, explodes on the output side. And the reason that you do this either on the output or the input side, do drops or explodes, depends on this. If you do a couple of test translations to check the output and make sure you got the settings that you want, if sometimes you'll drop status on blocks, and you'll end up with, in the output files, a bunch of block attributes strewn all over the file. So what you do is go back, and the way the program works is you can change your settings and then go project save, and then do another test translation and check your output to see that if you're getting the expected output you want. If not, go back, tweak the settings, save the settings, do another test translation until you're sure you're getting the output you want. And then you save those, and you'd use that settings file to translate the files for that particular project or client, that sort of thing. So that's why drops or explodes exists here, and also in the pre-processing side is based on the test translations that you do, you can determine which, if any, of the drops you may need to do are going to work best, either on input or output. Modify gives you some tools like this. You can replace special text characters where if the input font of the input files uses a centerline symbol that is used throughout your input files, but on the output side, the font that you're mapping to just happens to not have a matching centerline symbol, then you could borrow a centerline symbol from another output font to replace that centerline symbol if needed. And it gives you a bunch of other tools as well. You can also compress or purge the output files. That just makes them leaner and meaner for handling afterwards. And then it creates a backup of the files that you post-process as well. So that being the case, that ends the translation tips DWG and DGN webinar with a tiny bit of Translation Manager thrown here at the end. And if there's any questions, go ahead and, I know it was used earlier, but the chat bubble is the second one from the left. Any questions that you might have of things that I covered, you could enter into the chat bubble, And Paul will help gather those questions, and I'll answer any with the time I've got left here. So, are there any questions related to the earlier translation stuff that I handled, or not? Paul, are you there?
I am here, and I got to tell you, there is always more to learn every time I watch it. It's just amazing. So here, right now, I have a question from Susanna, and she asks, have you ever tried Translator with F.Kit? F.Kit is AutoCAD's Civil 3D platform, but adapted for F.dot standards.
I haven't myself, no. In fact, I just talked to a gentleman the other day who's a subcontractor for a contractor for that does work for Florida DOT, and I haven't dealt with them directly. If they've got a setup for that's adapted to FDOT standards, then in my experience of dealing with FDOT in the past, then they've got that set up the way they want, so that if you can then if you then need to output that to MicroStation form, I don't know, but they should be in the form that they need, and any seed files that you might need or template files that you might need related to working with them, they should be easily available to you through their website, if I recall right.
Interesting. Got it. I just want to make sure that does address the question, Susanna. I hope that does for you. Sounds about correct. The next question, we're going to move on to Somos, and the question is, can you do an example of a sheet that needs to be measured in feet? For example, a civil drawing instead of an architectural drawing? Is that possible? Is that something we could take offline for a one-on-one presentation? Is that something you don't do?
No, it's just the general data that I gave you would apply. Even though I was using architectural drawings, the same data as far as, because I just use those just for example, just for translation purposes, is when it comes to the seed file, is make sure that the seed file, if you're going to be working with a state DOT and they require U.S. survey feet, is just make sure that your seed file is set up and then do the translation accordingly. That should handle where you've got an input civil drawing from like the AutoCAD side and trying to map it or push it out to a MicroStation side. Everything I showed you generally should work in that same fashion, just doing the same operations with the same settings. I just don't have a setup of a civil file that I could find real quick and just give you an example.
Got it. Question also is, thank you for that answer, Fredrick. The question is do you have a workflow from AutoCAD layout sheets to MicroStation?
Now, well, the layouts, they're 2D, and the only thing that you'd have to care for in the translation is, well, there's a couple of things. One is in the one setting that I showed you related to on the output side, going from file save as DWG, or no, file save as DGN, after you've opened the DWG file, is make sure that you've got paver space set to be 2D on output to MicroStation. Now, what that's going to do on the MicroStation side of things is it should then just create a sheet model within the design file that you're doing the translation to. In other words, MicroStation is similar to AutoCAD in that you have layouts are the equivalent basically of sheet models in a MicroStation file. So any layouts that you have in the AutoCAD side, when you translate over, they should translate over directly to MicroStation sheet models. Now, the difference is you only have one model space in AutoCAD, but you can have multiple roughly model spaces in MicroStation. But you shouldn't run into a problem with that on the model space side. But the paper space side, as far as a workflow, it's just, you set up your work as you would normally in AutoCAD, and then when you do the translation, is just make sure on the settings area that I showed you for output that you do just make sure that it outputs those sheets as 2D, and that should care for then creating them as sheet models in the output DGN file.
Got it. All right. Thank you for that, Fredrick. I think that should address the questions from Thomas. We want to move on to our next question. Tom F. asks, does using File Translator eliminate the need to create CSV files in Excel?
So, well, the answer is no, not really. Now, in MicroStation, when it comes to the input side of going from DWG to DGN, and also output from DGN to DWG, the comma-separated value files are still utilized, and they're utilized for this purpose, to map levels to layers, models, or levels to layers, fonts to fonts, colors to colors, things of that nature. That comma-separated value file is where the finer control comes in for the bulk of the translations that you're going to be doing one way or the other. Now, that being the case, when it comes to Translation Manager, our program, since it uses the MicroStation or AutoCAD command line driven translator, it has the same capabilities to use that comma separated value file. And again, it doesn't eliminate the need for using that, because if you have requirements that where elements have to be on certain levels or certain layers when you finish the translation, and the colors have to be right and the fonts and so forth, none of that eliminates the need for comma separated value files. In other words, using MicroStation's own translations methods and using AutoCAD's own, and even using our own Translation Manager, that comma separated value file is a key to making sure that if your requirements are very stringent as far as what the output files need to look like and how they need to be set up, you're still going to be using them.
Interesting. All right, Fredrick. I think that addresses that. Someone comes back and asks, actually, Tom also asked real quick, do we have, what are some of the tools you offer for Revit? Well, actually, I'm going to let Fredrick answer that. We have currently one Revit tool, and we were at Autodesk University back in November. And we always ask the engineers, and we say, what is, in the architects, what is it that you're looking for? And they particularly look for this one functionality, and we presented it to them, and I'm going to let Fredrick explain it.
All right. So currently in Revit, we have one program, which is our Microsoft Office Importer program. It actually is patterned off of our long-running MicroStation program since 1996 of the same name, Microsoft Office Importer. It gives you the ability to import Word and Excel data files or portions of them into Revit with very exact formatting. And in Revit, it operates a little bit different than it does in the MicroStation and AutoCAD versions, in that you can import data into sheets in Revit, but also the current version, which is about to be released in a release version here very, very soon, will allow you to also paste in drafting views and also into legends. And it gives you the ability to split paste in the columns across a sheet, where you can then grab the different columns, cut them, paste them onto other sheets as needed, and yet when you do an update based on a change in the source Word or Excel file, it'll all act like one paste, and it'll all update no matter where in the sheets you copied those extra columns. And then, so that should answer that question. We're also looking at other programs to develop for Revit based on feedback and we've got a few ideas. So the more feedback and requests we get for other things to help in a Revit workflow, we're very open to receiving, because they're going to help drive our development in that area.
Good point, Fredrick. I always know we actually have been in business for quite a long time, and we've gotten into a habit of listening to our engineers and architects, and we actually produce a lot from their feedback. Now, Tom, I just wanted to extend something to you, or anyone else who's interested in our tool for Revit. If you happen to be on LinkedIn, I have a special presentation that is available for you, but it's only available on LinkedIn. So if you send me your LinkedIn ID, or you can send me an email, I can send you the link, but you have to keep your LinkedIn open in order to see it. But I can also extend a private one-on-one presentation of our Revit tool, and I'll do that with Fredrick. Fredrick, would you be willing to do that as a plus for any of these attendees?
I live to do those demos.
Okay, I love it. I love it. So I'd love to set that up for you. You can see that and see how it pertains to your project. I can say that I've worked with some of the best Revit users and teams around the world, and every single time they see the presentation, they're amazed and they love it. It's an incredible productivity tool. I can attest to that. A quick question, Fredrick. We have a few more questions. Somas asks, how about Civil 3D objects to inroads?
That's a very good question. Now, here's the problem. Civil 3D objects and open roads objects, even when you get down into this base MicroStation 3D objects and MicroStation-based 3D objects, some of them don't translate over or aren't supported one format to the other. Now, that being the case, here's what you've got. You've got really two options. In every case, you're going to have to translate out to the other format using some different settings to see if the output through the translators that are available give you the output you expect in the other format. In some cases, some of the objects just are not supported at all. And if that's the case, then you're going to find that out when you do a test translation. You might have to isolate an area that you want to look at in the input file, and then that has the objects that are in question. Do the test translation, and then look at that same area in the output file. That's going to tell you, without doing anything special with the settings, if it's going to even translate the objects out to the other format or not. From there, you then have the other option, and that is this. If the objects are not translating out at all, then you do have the option on the AutoCAD side or Civil 3D side of grabbing the object, making a copy of it, or making a copy of the file, select the object and explode it into line work, and then translate it out, and then it will at least translate out to line work. And in that case, on the output side, you've at least got the line work that you can then create the necessary object in the output format that would be comparable to the input format. But the only way you're going to know that is one of two ways. One is you need to check the documentation of the translators going out to the other format, and also the going both ways actually, depending on what output you're trying to do. And then based on that data, you may then need to do a test translation to see how it's going to output those objects. And then even from there, if it doesn't output them the way that you expect, you may have to go back, make a copy of the file, drop the object into a line work, and then export it that way. I wish I had a simpler answer, but unfortunately I don't. It's simply because each format deals with its own objects differently on as far as the translators than the other format deals with those types of objects. It's just the nature of the beast dealing with one format or the other.
Got it. One second. So Soma says, thanks, Fredrick. And
welcome.
Yep. I'm wondering if we've answered. Did we address how about Civil 3D objects to inroads?
Yes, I just did that.
Okay, that's the one we just did. I'm just looking if there's any more, because I know we skipped a little bit here.
Okay.
I think we're all good on the current questions. I did want, in closing, I did want to open the field up to any more questions, but I do want to extend a special something and a incentive to anybody that has come. Some of our tools are available for getting a trial. Some of our tools are available for a trial version, not all of them, and I'd be willing to help you acquire the trial version. I'd also want to extend to you a free one-on-one presentation with Fredrick for all of our efficiency tools, but specifically the ones that you might use on your project, and you can tell Fredrick about what projects you work on, and he may suggest what efficiency tools might be best utilized by your company or yourself. And I'd be really interested to help you out. If you could just put your, you could shoot me an email. You can shoot me connection on LinkedIn, and I will arrange that for you. Or you could just call in any time. And we are here to be of service. Just let us know how we can help. Fredrick, I see no further questions, so
Great.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I'll leave the floor in your hands.
Okay, thanks everybody for joining. I hope this was beneficial to you. You kept me on my toes with all of your questions, and I expect that more and more. So next time you'll have to do more homework to keep me on my toes even more. So thanks again. Thanks for attending. And with that, I'll let you go. Bye-bye.
And as for Tom, I know, Tom, you said that you're at Lanigan Engineering. I looked on LinkedIn real quick. I can't find you, but if you want to send me your email, I can reach out to you, or I'll have someone reach out to you and get you a private one-on-one demonstration with Fredrick. I'm glad to do that for you. We appreciate your time spending it with us. If you just want to put your email inside of the chat window, or you could reach out to me directly at the email that I put into the chat window, whatever works best for you, Tom.
All right, with that, I'm going to stop recording here, and I'm going to get off the phone.
Okay, Fred.